Hello, I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. I'm the Dungeon Tutor. And I'm Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Thanks for joining me. Hello friends, I am Rob, the Dungeon Tutor. Today we're going to cover in this session the roles in a role-playing game. One of the things that 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, yeah, I know, some people really hated it, but it did do a good job in some cases of delineating certain roles and expressions that we've been using for some time now, and some of them were really well crystallized in 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And I just wanted to kind of go over those and demonstrate how these are appropriate, maybe to help players to kind of think about the roles in the role-playing game that aren't the name of their character, their background, their voice, and all of that is their role. No, I'm talking about whether or not you are, and these are the 4 roles, primarily in Dungeons & Dragons, as far as 4th edition was concerned, and it seems to hold pretty true. The tank, the leader, the striker, and the controller. Now, different people use different terms for those, and that's fine, but in general, the role is fairly well defined. Okay. So, and there are some classes that, even if they technically should kind of fit in one of those classes, they may not do a good job, and some of them bleed from one to the other. Sometimes you can change entire roles by your choices that you make for your path or your backgrounds or what have you. But in general, and also remember this too, 4th edition was really focused, laser focused on encounters, combat, the fighting parts of it. That's why it probably should have been a tactics game more so than actual Dungeons & Dragons, but fine. That was the focus, and all of the characters generally fit into one of those 4 boxes. If we're going to open it up into a full role-playing game where the entire world is in bounds, I would also add a diplomat, or also known as a face character, who does a lot of talking and social interactions, something that some of those other more focused classes aren't as good at. But I digress. First of all, we've got the tank. I think most people understand tank. It's a real easy one to understand. It is what oftentimes is considered your frontline character, the person who puts themselves between danger and the rest of the group. Tanks are characterized by having a few traits. Number 1, they can survive the ire of their opposition for a limited amount of time. I mean, there may be some builds that are nigh indestructible and can stand there and take whatever for as long as they need to. Yeah, there's probably some way of doing that in Dungeons & Dragons, but typically that's not a finite thing. Your life is a finite thing. Eventually, enemies will get lucky enough to hit, hurt, whatever you define success as. God, I'm having a problem. Better. The first role is the tank. And most people understand what a tank is. They are your front line. They are the characters that are built to kind of take the punishment from your opponents so that the other characters don't have to. They are built or geared or whatever to be able to either absorb tremendous punishment, deflect enormous punishment, or possibly even to absorb and use excessive punishment for some other trick. That's probably the defining characteristic, but there's a secondary characteristic that's awfully useful for a tank. And that is the ability to draw the attention of the enemies, to make themselves the target. Not just stand there, but to be somebody that the opposition has to consider. A tank who has no threat to them at all can be safely ignored while the enemy tries to go after the softer members of the group. A good tank needs to have a way to stop the enemy from being able to considerably do that. And if you don't have any teeth to you, you don't have any means to stop your opponents from just walking around you because you have no threat, then you're not a very good tank. You're just a stumbling block. If there's a couple of you, you might be able to make a living wall, but that's about it. So a tank should have some offensive capabilities, something that an enemy just can't ignore, and that would make a pretty ideal tank. Now, a leader, on the other hand, is usually a pretty good friend of a tank. A leader, and I don't think leader is the greatest term. I think support is generally more widely used. But a support character, or a leader, is the person who decides, if you think about it as a tactical battlefield, where the party goes, where the offense is going to be strongest, where relief is needed. And they kind of decide in a party with any choices. Let's face it, if you've got 3 members of the party, many of your options are going to be somewhat limited. But the leader determines where and when the offense of the party is going to be leveraged the strongest and supports that. So if you're playing a cleric, which is the classic leader role, you can buff the group in the areas that it needs to be buffed, which means to make strong. Spells like Bless certainly are going to become your prototypical ones for that, but there are a number of protection spells that can enhance the defenses of your group. There are classes that may be considered other classes typically, but if you want to make, say, a wizard who casts Enlarge Person on their allies and False Life on their allies, they can be every bit as much of a leader or a support class as you want them to be. All depends on how you're playing your character out, but the support character generally does not focus themselves on doing a ton of damage or attracting the attention of the enemy. They need a little bit more freedom to be able to move around and go from hotspot to hotspot, whatever that may be. They may be good at filling in a pinch in one of the other roles, or possibly multiple roles. I mean, if you're looking at, for instance, a bard, a character who has potential with the abilities of their class to do a little bit of everything, yeah, a lot of bards can move up to the front in a pinch for a little bit, not a long time, but they can step up as need be. Maybe some of them can be pretty nasty strikers and can, zip in and potentially do a fair amount of damage at a time. Many of them are decent controllers, being able to debuff your enemies and put whole batches possibly to sleep or charming and things like that. They make pretty good controllers. But some of them are just really good at shoring up people, inspiring folks, and then playing a nice healing song to take somebody who's down and bring them back up. That's really what support do. They fill in where they need to be at any given moment. And oftentimes those roles get proscribed by the rest of the party around them. They fill in holes and they make the strength of your parties stronger while obviating the weaknesses as much as you can. Now, strikers are purely concerned with damage. It's pretty obvious typically when you see somebody who is a dedicated striker. They either make sure they can harm their opponents as often as possible or stack up as much damage as possible. Now, again, this can be a wide variety of classes. Rarely is it a class that's concentrated in melee and wearing a lot of armor. A lot of games generally tend to mitigate the amount of damage those characters can really crank out unless you go to extreme lengths, either making a character who's incredibly super duper strong or, other things. But mostly those classes are going to do it by keeping themselves out of harm's way as much as possible, possibly relying on a tank, possibly relying on distance and ranged attacking, and keeping your opponents in the dark, or attacking from ambush. And that makes classes like rogues pretty ideal strikers, considering their burst damage with their sneak attacking. They can lay that on and do a lot of damage and then skedaddle out of the way and set up for another sneak attack somewhere else. That's one of the strongest ways of playing a rogue. It limits your exposure to danger and allows you to maximize your damage. Rangers oftentimes can be strikers, concentrating on just leveraging a high dexterity perhaps, and a bow that can hit enemies at a distance and shoot them without being the targets of being shot themselves. countering enemy archers, firing support in on opponents that are already engaged, dropping them quicker. And ranged fighters oftentimes do this too. They are more strikers than they would be tanks in that situation. Spellcasters, wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, they can all be strikers. Absolutely. Some of their spells are some of the most devastating in the game, and especially with their opportunities in some of those classes to hit multiple opponents at a time. It's not necessarily about, destroying your entire batch of opponents with a single fireball. Sometimes weakening a batch of opponents with a fireball and then letting your other strikers and tanks possibly start dropping opponents on first contact or quicker can be just as effective. And, you can take credit for a lot of those kills too. But it's all about doing damage without taking damage in return is when you are the best. If you have to fill a tank's role, you're generally not going to do a good job. You're going to take a lot of unnecessary damage. Generally, your strikers have lower armor classes or lower resistances to damage, whatever variety, than the person who is geared up to be on the front line. Now, sometimes that can be a matter of what attire you're wearing, too. For instance, if you are running around in leather armor because you don't like to have disadvantages to, various skills and abilities, and you like to, fire, but you still tote around a sack of plate armor so that if something happens, the main fighter gets hurt to the point where it's not prudent to let them in the front line, maybe you take the leather off, put on the plate mail, and you can go shoot up to the front and find yourself being fairly effective as a tank too. Yeah, some groups have people who fill multiple roles based on the needs of the group. Sometimes it's just a matter of how you're geared to determine what your role is. But oftentimes that also is a function of your various classes, various abilities that you try to accumulate that cements your place in a given class. The final class that's the big four focus of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons Wizard Controller. And that's a person who alters the battlefield or alters the opponents to change the very nature of the battle. Powerful wizards can do that in a variety of ways by creating walls that screen off enemies, or again, creating area effects that opponents have to slog their way through, which can impede certain foes or maybe injure or disable them as they're going along. Sometimes it's an all or nothing thing, like a whole person, and boom, all of a sudden that opponent's not a danger to you anymore. There's so many flavors of control. But almost all of them involve doing something to the battlefield or to the opposition that changes how they can fight your group. And that's all to the advantage of your group. A good controller on your side makes encounters easy. They can obviate some encounters, and otherwise, they add to your side as a force multiplier. They're not the ones that are generally as focused on dealing damage. That is an important disambiguation in the roles that you select. And again, many classes can do multiple roles. If you throw a fireball one round and a color spray at the other, you've flip-flopped your roles. You don't have one defined role, and that's fine. But generally, groups learn to rely on a particular role that somebody is going to fill a given role in a given scenario. And if you are flexible enough to do multiple things, that's often for the good. Now, bucking those trends oftentimes just puts you into another category, right? If you're a fighter and you decide, I don't want to wear the heavy armor and I just want to concentrate on ranged attacks, or I want to multi-class into Warlock so I can be a Warlock who wears plate armor and blasts people with my Eldritch Blasts, you're basically just changing one category for another. It's nothing crazy. It just means that you're redefining a role. It means, too, that you are going to be somewhat of a different facet in that role than somebody who is purely in that role. And oftentimes, that distraction makes you less effective than somebody who focused purely in that given role. Like, for example, the person who starts out as a fighter knows how to use all the weapons, yes. They know how to wear heavy armor, yes. Shield, yes. But now they can cast spells as a warlock. They can Eldritch Blast all day. They can throw out a couple of spells. They get some other nifty, spoopy powers. Sure. But they've just kind of slowed down a little bit of that warlock path by branching off into being a fighter. A lot of warlocks don't find that heavy armor is essential or even wanted. And being able to use all the weapons, if you're only ever going to use one weapon, and if that one weapon is your Eldritch Blast, then that didn't help you all that much, and it actually slowed you down. It took away some of the proficiencies that warlocks commonly used. It took away another level's worth of advancement that you spent dallying around with swords and armor. It's complicated. A lot of people think there's nothing wrong with taking a dip here and a dip there, and they're right. There isn't anything wrong with it. It just means that your character's focus is a little muddled, and sometimes, sometimes the synergy is worth it. Sometimes it's not. It all depends on how you play, how rapidly you're going to need that power to keep up with the challenges of the world and the story you're going through. Sure. But, that is something to consider as you're planning your character, or you reach a level and you have to make decisions. Thinking about that can be effective. Now, of course, I said there's another one. There's the face, or the diplomat of the group, and there's a lot of social skills in D&D. At the very least, you've got deception, diplomacy, stuff like that. Intuit, those are good ones to have. Often there's going to be a character in a group designated to master those skills, because they're useful for everybody to have, but not everybody wants to spend whatever it would take to get those skills. See, so that's something that often a group will pick up. Now again, this is something that somebody by default can do. If you have a bard, they can be a support character that also is your talker. And I think that often gets lumped in with the support character. Again, the idea of a leader being the person that does speak for the group, because they do have those kind of skills. That's part of the support package. I don't find that necessarily to be the case, but it's not a bad one. And of course, in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, you can get by in a pinch with somebody who just has a high charisma score. And who might do that? Well, paladins, who can be good tanks, who can be decent strikers, and can be pretty good in support. Warlocks, primarily strikers or controllers, but they're going to have a good charisma score typically, so they're, by default at least, going to have some pretty darn good social skills, and maybe they'll even specialize in a couple, like deception, that work really well for warlocks. So they can serve that role, and there isn't a class that specifically drills down into that, although, again, bards have a couple of nice ones. There are some backgrounds, and there are some character paths that you can take that are more built around integrating with the world. The mastermind, for instance, as a background for the rogues or bards, whichever. It's all about how your character is socially, and how they have wormed their way into the society to become a master of manipulation in the social sphere, more so than in the dungeon. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. On some campaigns, that would be excellent. In something focused on dungeon delving, not as much. But, it's the price you pay for specialization. And again, this might have more of an application for games other than Dungeons & Dragons, too. For something that's a point-based system, like GURPS, or something that has a wider range of different focuses, like Shadowrun, a face character does tend to stand out more against all the other backdrops of proficiencies. A person who is really good at talking doesn't necessarily need the chrome of a street samurai, or the guns of a merc, or the magic of a mage or shaman to be really effective. They could be a negotiator, they could be a detective, they can use a variety of other skills that are absolutely essential to a team of Shadowrunners, and still be an effective member of the group. Even when the lead is flying, they might be able to, fire off a few shots. Maybe they're relatively ineffective in those situations, but they can apply their other social skills of observation and listening, and maybe tricking the enemies and doing other things. They should look for means other than going against their prime role to still help out the group. Sometimes that can be really hard, but it's a challenge of playing that kind of a character. So those are primarily the 5 capital R roles in role-playing games. I find that generally kind of knowing what your role is and leaning into that is most effective when your group is cognizant that these things exist. Sometimes people will instinctively go into that. It's like, oh, wow, if I make this paladin and I go along this path, I could be the greatest striker ever. I could do so much damage. And they've boxed themselves in as a striker who can also possibly absorb quite a bit of damage, depending on how you roll for hit points and stuff. Maybe a person who's playing a wizard thinks, oh, if I had this spell and this spell, they would work so well together. And maybe they've boxed themselves into a role too, without actually even saying necessarily that they're going to be a great controller. They can possibly end up doing a fantastic job of keeping enemies off the group or protecting them against a variety of dangers or messing with a whole diverse batch of enemies. Sure, why not? These are not hard and fast rules. These roles are speculative, but they work quite well in defining certain people's playstyles and the effect that certain people have as far as synergy within a group. This has been from years and years and years of play. Almost all characters fit in that box somewhere. So, something to think about, right? Something to possibly look into the next time you make a character. And if you are going to try to play a game and say you only have 3 characters, one of them is a striker, one of them is a controller, one of them is a leader, you have no tank. So somebody else is likely going to have to fill in that role or maybe share that role, possibly taking more damage than a tank properly would, but being able to just kind of make it as you cobble it all together on the fly. Or if you're going along without a controller and say you've got 3 people, you've got a tank, you've got a striker, and you've got a leader. Maybe the leader will keep the others alive long enough so that they can go through a much harder fight than you might have had than if you'd had that controller ready with their finger on the button to take care of a group of enemies at a time, so that the group challenge would have been a lot less in a given situation. Or, all these different things. If you have no striker, combats take longer. Your enemies are going to, take more punishment because you have less direct and heavy damage from one of those classes. If you have no leader, you might really have to be very careful pulling out of battles and choosing your battles wisely, because you can't recover very fast and you can't give yourselves the large-scale advantages that really pile up in the course of a game. So something to think about, certainly. And quite honestly, again, if you despair for any of these things, you think it's all too cut and dried, you think it's all too bottled up and labeled, it's just a generality. It's not an accusation about your group not having something. It's not pointing out and saying, see, you needed this. No. Sometimes it's just a challenge to overcome the lack of a defined role in a group, whether it's by necessity or it's because just what the group decided to do. Sometimes it can be exciting playing around with those wants. Almost every group has imagined, wow, what would a group with everybody playing a wizard be like? It can be madness and chaos, but when it works, does it work? You could be playing and, playing everybody as a fighter. That could be a slow slog, but it can be very effective as all of your people are okay at mitigating damage, and against some opponents, you can do really, really well. Against some opponents, you don't have the depth to take on. Even a dragon fight for a group that's just made up of fighters can be hard. So, just some thoughts. Hopefully, this entertained you at least, or got you thinking. And if you've already heard all of this before, you've read that, If you think it's good advice and these are credible, yeah, feel free to leave in the comments. If you think it's all hooey and everybody is their own character and these roles are just something somebody with too many degrees came up with and decided, yes, this is how it should be, feel free to leave that in the comments too. We can talk about that. But more, I just hope that you enjoyed this, and if you did, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. And hit the notification button, you know, that little bell thing, so that you can see when I make more videos. But I'm really hoping that you enjoyed this. I hope that you look forward to more videos in the future, because there are many more lessons to get to, including some more technical ones we're going to start going into with a variety of games. So, until next time, I'm Rod the Dungeon Tutor. Thank you for joining me on this lesson. This one is now over, so until the next session, farewell.